An expedition into the rainforests of northern Colombia. But these explorers are not in search of rare butterflies. They're here to collect blood. They are geneticists. The purpose of their expedition? To collect the DNA of endangered species, of humans. In laboratories across the world, the cells of indigenous peoples are being immortalized, multiplying indefinitely to provide a biological bank for genetic research. For 10 years now, scientists from a genetics institute in Bogota have been traveling into the least accessible parts of Colombia. They're building up a biological bank of blood cells taken from isolated tribes who are genetically unique. Soon they may be sharing these samples with scientists worldwide as part of an international program, the Human Genome Biodiversity Project, which wants to collect and store the DNA from 700 tribes in danger of extinction. But they face unexpected opposition.
La usurpación que ha habido en los territorios indígenas, en el despojo de nuestras tierras, en el despojo de la cultura, en el despojo de nuestro subsuelo, en el despojo de nuestra ideología, en el despojo de nuestras tradiciones. Puede ser esto también otro despojo que hagan y que nos utilicen realmente como materia prima, como algo que nosotros tenemos y que ellos ignoran.
The geneticists see themselves only as pure scientists. Dr. Alberto Gomez specializes in immune systems. His colleague, Ignacio Briceño, is studying for a PhD at Newcastle upon Tyne. He wants samples to take back to his lab in England. Today, they're climbing into the Sierra Nevada of northeast Colombia to visit the Ahuaco people. The Ahuaco number only about 11,000 and rarely intermarry with other tribes. This makes them genetically unique, ideal material for the Diversity Project. But a history of exploitation and violence has made the Ahuacos suspicious of the white man. A few years ago, the Ahuaco rebelled against the imposition of a foreign language and culture. Missionaries and teachers were expelled from their community. The visiting scientists will have to reach an understanding with the tribe if they're to get their blood samples.
Buenas.
¿Verdad? Sí, ¿verdad?
Bien.
¿Cómo están?
¿Y usted?
Bien, ¿qué tal?
Aquí, esperando a su compañero.
Bueno,
Unknown
ya
to the scientists, strange rumors have preceded their arrival.
Nosotros no podemos engañarlos a ustedes. Ustedes miran muy bien a los ojos de las personas. Para nosotros es muy difícil, siendo jóvenes y siendo, teniendo estas místicas, no va con nosotros engañar. Hay otras personas en el gobierno y en el país que quieren proyectar esa imagen, no sabemos por qué. Puede ser por celos, puede ser por mezquindad, no sabemos. Entonces les traen aquí unos cuentos rarísimos que vamos a discutir esta noche de la sangre, que estamos haciendo ahuacos perfectos y cosas raras. Eso es imposible. someone from the community told me today that there was a woman that came here, woman representing the government, and told them that we really didn't want to do the tests, but what we really want is to get pure Ahuaco blood to be able to clone the perfect Ahuaco in our laboratories. And besides that, find a way to destroy all the community by genetic approaches. Genetics, cloning, all these terms are very difficult for these people to understand.
The scientists gain the confidence of the tribe by offering them medical services. They set up their clinic in a disused schoolroom.
Muy bien. Este lo pueden guardar si quieren, no tiene sangre, no es peligroso. ¿Qué no quieren?
The service includes a test for diabetes.
Del químico, un poquito al principio, después ya no le vuelve a doler, ¿bueno?
Más o menos cero.
Lleva un capítulo de chico que ya...
Sí, ahí es el reactivo.
But in addition to the sample for the diabetic test, another sample is taken for the biological bank. The Indians are told that this is so that tests for other diseases can be made back in the lab. No mention is made of immortalization.
El médico me contó pues era que ahí permanecía, o sea que la sangre. Pues de ahí sabía de todo. No volverían, o sea que no volverán volver a sacar análisis de sangre otra vez, que allá estaba. Entonces la gente pues, muchos decían de que, decían la comunidad de que análisis de la sangre se piensa, ¿no? De pronto tal vez de que se vaya a tener allá por negociación, se imagina así, anoche se preguntó mucho.
In fact, we don't tell every community at the first point. We don't arrive say, hello, we are immortalizing yourselves, because that's not a proper protocol. First thing you do is you go there, you arrive, and you are in the silence of the community, and you just wait for something to happen. And then the relationship goes on, and then you get to know people who may be receptive.
Ellos no han sido honestos explicándole a las autoridades indígenas qué vienen a hacer y qué vienen a buscar. Y creemos que si ellos han tomado estas muestras con este fin, es arbitrario, porque no se ha sido honesto con las comunidades para contribuirles a ellos a un banco de sangre en donde no sabemos si nosotros vamos a servir de laboratorios para los estudios que ellos quieran.
Are there any ethical problems with the Human Genome Diversity Project? How do you get consent for this? How do you get consent from a tribe that either has never seen the outside world, or the only time it's seen it, it's been shooting at it, right? Or trying to take away its habitat in terms of its animals that live around it, its plants that live around it, and the things that it uses to survive. It seems to me that it is unlikely that any so-called vanishing tribe that understood the project, understood that what you want to do is take our DNA before we vanish, before we become extinct because of what the first world is doing to us, or because of what's going on in our country, that you want to take from us the only thing that you value. And so therefore, you'll be totally indifferent to whether we survive or not. It seems unlikely that you would consent to that.
Would it be better not to do it the way that they propose doing it, and yet have these ethnic groups disappear and their genetic heritage vanish, and no? I mean, is that would that be a good thing?
That's a fair question. Yeah, that's a fair question. It's their DNA, and so you can't just go and take it without their informed consent. And I think that it is virtually impossible at this stage to get the informed consent of indigenous people to this. Number one, I think if they understood the project, they would refuse. And number two, if they don't understand the project, they can't give consent. So it's just total exploitation. It's taking things which can be of no benefit to them.
The average person, even with a half-decent education, wouldn't know, much less some poor indigenous person out in the bush, out in the mountains, who doesn't even know what DNA is, much less what they're allowing to happen.
What they are allowing to happen is the immortalization of human blood cells. This is the Yale laboratory of Professor Ken Kidd, a key figure in the Diversity Project.
Here we have some cells from the Caucasus, population Adigi from the Caucasus Mountains, from a collaboration with individuals in Russia. Here we have some cells of Siberians, and here we have some cells of a Native American population. These on this side are not growing very well, but these are growing very well. There's a color indicator in here when they need feeding and more medium, the pH changes.
We have been historically the guinea pigs, the lab rats for a lot of experiments, for a lot of learning and collection of knowledge. And once again, we're being put in that perspective. And in many cases, it's unknowingly or unwillingly. They've not asked whether we want to be the subject of this.
Here we have the final stage of the growing of the cells. This is a warm room kept at a constant temperature, body temperature. These are human cells. From those small flasks you saw in the other incubator, when they get to larger volumes, we put them in these roller bottles where the motion and the temperature allows them to grow up to very large numbers of cells, and then from that we can extract large amounts of DNA. And the DNA is now precipitating out of solution. It's millions and millions of copies of every DNA molecule, and they're very long and thin molecules, so they can be spooled up, just like spooling up a lot of thread, onto this glass pipette and pulled out, and there is millions and millions of copies of DNA molecules.
Today's technology allows the geneticist to actually print out the genetic code within the DNA. The vertical lines are segments of DNA. The colored blobs are the 4 chemical digits which make up the code, usually represented by the initials A, C, G, and T. There are 3 billion of these letters in the human DNA molecule. In this computer analysis, the horizontal lines show identical sections of DNA taken from a number of individuals. But once in a while, a variation occurs. One individual has one letter different from the others. This is the diversity the project is looking for. Isolated groups who have not mixed their genes with outsiders will have variations unique to that group. By comparing gene variations between groups from different parts of the world, the geneticist can calculate how distantly they are related and at exactly what point in history they diverged. Ken Kidd uses his samples to produce a genetic tree.
A lot of data says that humans originated in Africa and migrated out to fill the rest of the world. I think that's probably true, and this tree is compatible with this hypothesis, with African populations moving into the Middle East, modern Europeans descended from there, humans expanding into Asia, then expanding into the Pacific, and also then expanding into the New World.
Well, we know where we came from, and we know who we are, and we think we know where we're going. And why do we need to know anything else? I mean, is this for their benefit? It certainly isn't for ours.
Part of it's just basic curiosity about what we are as a species. Part of it is wanting to understand what factors cause different human genetic disorders to occur with different frequencies in different parts of the world. And without all of these DNA samples from all over the world, I couldn't do that.
We're taking from them their DNA, which we now consider like gold. It's even worse than kind of standard colonialism and exploitation, because we are taking the one thing that we value, and after we take that, we have no real interest in whether they live or die.
So what we hope to see at the end of the experiment is that, well, here is your DNA, and it's next to DNA from your classmates, and you can see that you're not all the same. And we know that from looking at each other. But a lot of these physical differences, of course, go back to the instructions that are encoded in your genes. And we're just trying to look at some of these areas of your DNA that potentially are different from one person to the next.
At Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in New York, a DNA learning center teaches American high school pupils to take their own genetic fingerprint.
This is a rare opportunity that you have to actually use state-of-the-art technology to look at a little bit of your own DNA.
These children give their DNA with informed consent. But their genes belong to the American melting pot, of little value to the Diversity Project. The kind of Americans the project wants may take more persuading. Oklahoma is home to the Ahuaco Indians, one of the 700 target tribes of the project.
In thinking about participating in the Diversity Project, you all also need to think about how you can protect yourselves, about whether the community wants to do this, about who will own or control the information that scientists get from the genes and the genetic information they take from you.
At a local Ahuaco gathering, Maurice Foster, an anthropologist who wants the tribe's participation, gets a skeptical response.
I've read in the paper about it that's becoming controversial because they feel like the drug companies can make a lot of money off that by selling these perhaps things that would prevent diabetes or heart disease. And so I think that should be considered before we give any blood to you or hair samples, the long-term effect of things.
While we can try to put in legal guarantees that it won't be exploited, these people know very well from their past experiences with the federal government that what people put on paper does not always turn out to be reality, and they should be very careful and very cautious about how they approach this.
This was the outcome of an earlier contact between the North American Indian and the scientific establishment. Tens of thousands of Indian bones, robbed from graves in the last century and distributed to museums across America for scientific research. Today, by act of Congress, ancestral remains are being returned for reburial.
We're packing them in red cloth because red is a sacred color to our people. And what I'm doing is I'm preparing him for his journey home and into the spiritual world of our people. Sage and tobacco. The tobacco and sage and the sweetgrass is very sacred to our people. he can smoke and pray and smudge himself on his journey. He'll enter the spirit world in good faith and be cleansed as he comes back in to his world that he's been in. He's been taken away from for over 100 years, that when he gets there, he'll be at home and his spirit will no longer have to roam.
They were starting to contour in the shape of our heads to find out if we had as big brain as white people did, because, of course, at that time it was thought that the size of your brain determined your intelligence. You know, how much different is that? Well, in this case, they're not lopping off people's heads or limbs or organs, or they're taking tissue and blood and other samples, but in some respects, it's not much different.
But for some, that difference is academic. Dead bones can still be as valuable as living blood. Stopping in the small Colombian town of Pasca, Dr. Briceño has his eyes on an extraordinary museum collection. These are the mummified corpses of leaders of the Muisca people, once carried aloft into battle to inspire fear in the enemy. They are over 600 years old.
What I'm going to do is to take a sample for DNA extraction. In this case, I'm going to take a piece of muscle or bone from this part that's exposed. This one is going to be more difficult because of the wrapping. I don't want to damage it, so I will have to take a tooth or maybe a piece of the hair. And this one will be in this case, it will be easier to take a piece from the abdomen that's exposed.
From DNA analysis of his samples, Dr. Briceño hopes to learn of the Muisca's genetic disposition to disease before Columbus. And with no Muiscas still alive, there is no one around to object.
La ciencia, con su tecnología, soluciona problemas, pero también es agresiva, agrede. Nuestras propias formas, nuestra propia forma de ver la humanidad, de ayudar a salvar el mundo, de cuidar la tierra, de hacer del hombre la hermandad como humanos, lo hacemos sin tecnología. La tecnología de nosotros está en la cabeza, en el corazón y en el espíritu, que es diferente.
Dr. Briceño rejoins his colleagues in their search for living samples. Their expedition moves on, this time on foot, into the forested mountains of the Sierra Nevada, home to the Asario tribe. Mules carry the equipment, a generator and a portable fridge for the blood samples. They're joined now by two colleagues from the United States.
Oh, look at all of them. This is a large colony. They carry many times their weight, I think.
Yes, they do.
Take one here.
Ouch!
Doctors Noble and Sankenberg are researchers from Roche Molecular Systems, a subsidiary of the pharmaceutical giant Hoffmann La Roche.
Because of our involvement with the Colombians, we now have access to samples such as the ones that are being gathered here, and that helps us very much to make a contribution to the Human Genome Diversity Project.
On the second day, the party reaches the Asario village.
So what is the men's hut? Only men can go in there, women
Buenos días. ¿Sí recibieron el mensaje?
Buenos días. Bueno.
Ay, niños.
Even more isolated than the Ahuaco, the Asario owe little to Western culture. In the men's house, coca leaves are exchanged. Coca is chewed almost constantly, the drug activated by an alkali, powdered seashell carried in a gourd. Rubbing off the residue on the neck of the gourd is part of a continuous ritual. With little or no marriage outside the group, they are even genetically different from the Ahuacos on the other side of the mountain. These are the Asario's neighbours, the Kogi, filmed in the 1950s when Colombian colonists used alcohol to sweeten negotiations. But the community's leaders saw omens of disaster and wanted nothing more to do with the outsiders. Today, the Indians of the Sierra deliberately reject much of the outside world. By night, with 4 fires lit, the men's house serves as a religious and social centre for the Asario village. This is a society with confidence in its own culture and heritage. Visitors are often unwelcome. But the scientists are made welcome. That's because the villagers have been told that they're a medical team, come to bring them much-needed treatment. Pilar Cortez is a Colombian final-year medical student. She offers each villager an examination. The Indians being tested for diabetes are given a glucose drink. A short while later, blood samples are taken for both the diabetes test and for the blood bank.
Y es solo para uno, sí. No se puede dar a probar a los niños.
The researchers from Roche Molecular Systems are here as observers. Field trips are part of the collaboration between the laboratories in Bogota and California. In exchange for information and technology, genetic material from the Colombian samples has ended up in the United States.
Listo. Ahí con el doctor entonces, por favor. 2-9.
Venga, muchinagua. Hombre, nagua.
Bueno, él. Tómelo despacio, ¿no? Es rico. María.
Muchima, hay.
Bueno, María, entonces va a tomar una cucharadita de esto, ¿sí? Es vitamina. Se la va a tomar hasta que después...
The benefit to this tribe, the immediate benefit, is that we've come in with physicians and we're providing medical, and in many cases the expedition has dentists as well, and so we can provide care for them that would be difficult for them to get otherwise. In the long run for these people, it's a more altruistic sort of goal for the greater human good. You know, it's not a direct benefit. We won't come in, take their DNA, look at it, and come up with a cure for one of their diseases next week.
The American team is studying genetic susceptibility to diabetes. Dr. Gomez is ambivalent about the relationship and any commercial implications it might have.
I do not have a personal relationship with the Roche lab. As long as these companies enter with an idea of not retrieving or not getting a direct commercial benefits of it, they are welcome.
We have to be very lucky that we can get here and we can have access to the samples, and we have to take care that their world is kept together and they don't have the feeling that we want to take things out of their world.
Listo, bueno. Présteme su brazo, parece acá. Eso sí está.
But the Indians are not fully consulted. They had not been told that their cells might end up in a biological bank and that their genes could also end up in California.
Bueno, ¿cómo está?
Yami Santaluga yami guagasca. Ya banco biológico guagasca daga no kung bime guashi nunca guar como guia gigaka jana nargo janicar como Santalo no kung tua nargo janicar no nima no guing raga respuesta angika wega na janekuna ni.
¿Y qué han dicho los médicos cuando llegaron aquí? ¿Cuál dicen es el motivo de la visita?
Negachikung bima guak no kagwari negachikung ba chanmam ke kwairu todavía duda bina inteno kugamba nagantuna wega rigwar.
There's no point really in telling them that we're going to do HLA typing on their genes because they wouldn't understand what HLA is in the first place. But I think that in as much as they can understand, they are in fact giving their informed consent. And I think that, you know, my idealistic side as a scientist says that this is for the greater good eventually, and they're contributing to mankind in general.
But do the Indians know they are contributing to mankind in general? And do they want to?
Pensamos que es inaudito, es insólito, realmente, que el mundo quiera tomar la gente que menos agresividad ha tenido frente al mundo, frente a la humanidad, y que tengamos la obligación de contribuir. Es un proyecto netamente arbitrario, netamente abusivo, y quizás la gente, es decir, las personas o las entidades o las instituciones que han programado esto a nivel mundial, ha sido una vez más otra forma de conquista, de colonizaje a los territorios indígenas y a las personas que lo habitamos. Consideramos que no tenemos obligación de contribuirle a la humanidad y mucho menos a la gente que lo ha dañado nuestros propios recursos y nuestras propias formas de ser y de pensar.
Back at the laboratory of Roche Molecular Systems, the Colombian samples are invaluable to Dr. Noble's work.
We here at Roche Molecular Systems, I think, are leaders in the field of HLA typing, actually looking at these genes and determining what they look like at the molecular level. Having the samples from Colombia is really a gold mine in terms of being able to look at something that we wouldn't necessarily ever have been able to look at otherwise. The benefits of this sort of study will not be immediate. They will be in the long term, but they'll be for everyone. If we find an association between a particular DNA type and a disease, then everyone with that DNA type will be able to know that they have a predisposition for a disease. The benefits will be for everyone, but having these inbred populations allow us to more easily determine those benefits.
But the possibility of a genetic association with the disease suggests the possibility of a cure from which someone would profit. Although Roche Molecular Systems is a subsidiary of Hoffmann-La Roche, the company is at pains to point out that the collaboration with the Colombians is a private arrangement between the scientists themselves. Analysis of the samples does take place in a laboratory owned by the company, but the salaries of the researchers are paid by government grant.
If some insight into genetic resistance to disease is found from these studies, it would just be part of the scientific literature and available to everybody. That is, Hoffmann-La Roche has no corporate interests or plans for this research. It's purely basic research that, in fact, as I mentioned earlier, is being funded by the National Institute of Health in our own lab. So it's not funded at all by Hoffmann-La Roche.
If a patentable, profitable product was created from a cell line of one or more of the indigenous people, much money could be made out of this. It depends, of course, what's found. No one knows exactly what's found. That's why some people call this prospecting and a genetic gold rush. But the theory is, of course, a lot of people wouldn't be interested in doing this at all. They didn't think they could find some valuable cell lines. And if those are patented and if they do produce products that are commercially useful, considerable money could be made. Hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars even.
And the genetic prospecting has already begun. These are the banana plantations of Changuinola in Panama. It's 100 years since the Guaymi Indians lost their homelands to the banana companies. But now there is something else the foreigners want from them. The Guaymi have recently been the focus of attention from scientists from a number of countries, including the United States, and their blood has been in considerable demand.
Hasta en 1991 se vino dando en la luz pública de que se tomaba la sangre del pueblo guaymi sin la consulta del pueblo. Sin la consulta del Congreso, el pueblo se sintió tan humillado por esta actitud, por cierta dirigencia, en la cual nuestra gente, como Guaymi, hicimos un rotundo no a este proyecto para que no se continuara con este asunto.
The project to collect blood samples is coordinated at the local hospital. What the Guaymi have that everyone wants is the human T lymphotropic virus, or HTLV2, a rare parasite which large numbers of Guaymi carry in their blood without any known harm to themselves. But what has outraged the community is this: an application for a patent by US government scientists on the cells of an unnamed Guaymi woman.
She apparently consented to have a blood, or someone took blood from her in any event, but I'm sure she has no idea that anybody's trying to commercialize something that came out of her body and make money from it, and I'm also sure that she'll never see a dime of it. So that's just a classic case of exploitation.
Se respeta la privacidad de la paciente.
porque como esto es manejado por un trabajo médico científico, usted no va a revelar los nombres. Sí entiendo que la persona está enterada de que se le tomó una muestra de sangre y que, digo, los archivos se guardan, pero no le puedo decir así a usted cuál es el nombre.
Absolutamente no sé nada del permiso. Ella no debe insultar nada con nosotros y por el momento nosotros no estamos de acuerdo que venga más tomar nuestra sangre este país. Y el pueblo no está muy de acuerdo para que venga más otro extranjero a este lugar.
After protests, the patent application was dropped by the US government, but only to be replaced by 2 further applications involving individuals from Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands.
What this patent shows, particularly a patent that the US government, the Department of Commerce, applied for in Ghana, what this shows is that if governments will do it, we certainly know that companies will do it, and what we're looking at is a new kind of bizarre form of colonialism, this time not for the coal or iron or ore of the countries of the world, but rather a new colonialism that invades the very bodies, the very cells and genes of third world peoples.
It appears that the same issues still are evident.
Applications for patents on cell lines owe their legitimacy to an astonishing precedent set by the California Supreme Court in 1990. John Moore, a Seattle businessman, had sought the advice of a lawyer, Jonathan Zaki, concerning persistent requests by his doctor for him to sign consent forms long after the doctor had removed his cancerous spleen. John Moore wanted to know what was going on.
I remember telling John on the telephone that we had discovered that someone had patented his cells, and he was absolutely shocked, as were we.
I never gave my informed consent to their patenting my cell line. I didn't even know they were doing it. I had no choice in that.
John Moore's cancerous spleen contained a rare blood protein capable of generating bacteria and cancer-fighting cells. They called it the Mo line, Mo for Moore.
I think the doctor didn't get the informed consent in this case because he had a chance to make a lot of money and didn't want to share it with the patient.
We determined that the doctor had exercised an option for, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 75,000 shares and warrants of stock from the biotechnical firm that he had an exclusive arrangement with.
John Moore sued the patent holders for ownership rights in his own cells and lost. The ruling said that the cells now belong to the biotechnical researchers, not to him.
It sets a very dangerous precedent. We've been hearing recently of other instances around the world where indigenous populations have been subjected to the same type of exploitation, that individuals have had their cells patented or appropriated without their knowledge or consent. And I believe that the researchers are doing it with the knowledge that this decision in the United States would protect them.
But if patent law is to protect the biotech companies, who is to protect the Indians? Inevitably, the targets for the Diversity Project are likely to be among the poorest and least informed groups. This is Carizal on the shores of the Colombian Caribbean, where the Wayu people earn a subsistence living by fishing and mining the salt flats. They are the latest target for the geneticists. Doctors Gomez and Briseño are pure academics. They personally have no commercial interest in their samples. They also express a concern to support the survival of these small cultures. But as members of the Diversity Project, they would see their samples distributed worldwide and out of their control. If a scientist can patent someone else's cells, then why not this person's DNA? The Institute for Genomic Research is the laboratory of Dr. Craig Venter, a keen supporter of the Diversity Project, and the man who has taken the patenting of human materials to the limits of credibility. While working for the US government, Dr. Venter developed a program for the rapid identification of human gene sequences. He then applied for patents on no fewer than 5,000 fragments which he had identified, even though he had no idea what they coded for.
What are the samples from? The reason that I filed for patents on the genes that we were discovering, which are human genes, was because there was no precedent. It was not clear what would happen if we had published all the data like we were going to without patent protection. The major fear was that would take the thousands of genes that we were discovering out of the market for pharmaceutical development. A patent is not ownership. A patent is a right for somebody to commercially develop an entity for a period of 17 years. Patenting is important in terms of getting things to the population in a commercially viable form.
The US government has dropped its DNA patent applications, but Dr. Venter has now moved his research into the private sector. His Institute for Genomic Research is funded by a commercial company, Human Genome Sciences, which holds development rights to his discoveries. Human Genome Sciences is backed in turn by venture capitalists. Dr. Venter's allotted shares in the company are currently worth $11 million.
The Venter case is biotechnology research at its very worst. He's trying to privatize the genetic commons, the 100,000 or more genes that make up the human body, trying to make it the private property of companies rather than the common heritage that we all own.
None of my colleagues in the Human Genetic Diversity Program have indicated the slightest interest in commercial exploitation at all as their motivation for doing this work. And it would be very easy to assign any putative rights that would come out of sampling for studying evolution and genetic variation to go to the endogenous populations. I think that would solve the problem.
Is it conceivable that some form of protection might allow people like these to profit from inventions? If so, who is to be their guardian? Who will police the new science?
Maybe a worldwide corporation under the United Nations or something like a Law of the Sea contract, where the benefits, whatever financial benefits are accrued from cell lines, a significant portion of those goes back to the source of the cell lines itself. It wouldn't be impossible to do, but it would, again, no one's tried to do it yet. No one's even talked about doing that yet.
But until this issue is properly addressed, the louder the voices of protest will become.
Today we're demanding that the United States government stop what is essentially genetic colonialism around the world. Through the Human Genome Diversity Project, this country has already funded scientists going into indigenous peoples, taking their blood, taking their genes, and potentially patenting those genes.
Nosotros, al menos como Confederación de Nacionalidades Indígenas del Ecuador, esto vamos a rechazar y más que todo denunciar y hacer una campaña, una red con toda la gente que está trabajando en este campo.
But if indigenous people object to the Human Genome Diversity Project and refuse to cooperate, then, the scientists argue, a major contribution to human knowledge and medical advancement may be lost forever.
It's possible. It's possible we've lost a contribution to human knowledge and human medicine, but I think taking human rights seriously and the fact that they are part of our human family seriously enough to try to prevent their extinction is a much more important gift to humanity than perhaps whatever scientific or medical advances might come from taking their DNA. The price is just too high, I think, for that knowledge.
I think the value of the Human Genome Diversity Project is very great in that I think we need to have access to these samples to be able to look at how genes have evolved in populations that are isolated before these populations are no longer isolated. I think that by having these wonderful peoples who haven't mingled with the rest of the population, we can really see what's happened in that population and then apply it to the mixed populations that we live in. It's a somewhat idealistic for the greater good of mankind. We need to have all these samples and be able to look at what's happened.
But the scientists will have to convince the Indians and their supporters of that idealism. Already, their time may be running out.
They were saying rescind all of those patents and deny all of those patent applications on the bodies and the body parts of those in the third world. Thousands and thousands around the world are saying, we do not want to become guinea pigs in your research project. These people know about this, and they are saying in a very loud international voice, no.